All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Well Said. Today we have Josh Holdenried, who is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Napa Legal Institute, which consults and educates religious leaders so as to better equip them to protect their organizations. Thanks, Josh, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Cherise.
Today's topic on the episode will be focusing on religious liberty and how it relates to such concepts as free speech and how religion is under threat today. I wanted to discuss this topic mostly because of just recent trends we've been seeing with the left's attempts to remove faith and religion from political discourse entirely, leading to kind of a unique form of censorship because we have this new version of Puritans, is what I call them. So I really am looking forward to this discussion. Because if free speech is the spine of our country, then religious liberty is the soul of the country, right? It's fundamental to who we are as Americans, as it has helped to inform and shape our politics and our laws. Of all the first world countries, America is one of the most religious when it comes to practicing, but oftentimes it doesn't really feel that way. Could this be because of a misinterpretation over time of the separation of church and state, to the extent where we refuse to acknowledge the connections of religion, the people, and therefore politics, which inevitably leads to the state? But there seems to be an unshakable desire to isolate the state from religion to the extent that we have forgotten the role faith plays in secular government. Secularism doesn't mean religion has no influence. It just means that religious institutions themselves do not rule. The separation is from church and state, not from faith and state. So let's not forget where many of the founders came from, obviously a continent where historically, if you were not the religion of the state, you are a second-class citizen. This is why religious liberty was so important to them and such a fundamental principle in the American founding. So religion plays a part, whether we like it or not. And today, for many, politics has become their religion, leading us down a newer path of not only trying to keep religion out of politics, but to rid society of religion altogether. So I want to open with a question before we delve deep into this. Josh, I want to open with, why is religion becoming the enemy of the state? I know it's a bit of a red meat question, but I'm very curious to hear it.
Yeah, no, it's actually, it's an interesting question. It's a good question. And actually, my first impression of that question is that, I mean, the word religion, what do we mean by religion? Again, because in our sort of crowded discourse, political discourse, civic discourse, religious liberty could mean one thing to one person, it could mean an entirely different thing to another person. And actually, what I thought was so interesting about our most recent presidential election was that our current president, President Biden, he, in the last, I'd say, 20 years of all the candidates I've seen at the national level, was the one who employed the most religious language. Him and his running mate, when they launched their campaign, or when he launched his campaign and she later joined, he characterized his run for the White House as a battle for the soul of the nation. And that's kind of interesting. And then also in his first national address, he also quoted, in his inaugural address, he quoted St. Augustine. I don't think there's ever been another president who's quoted a doctor of the church, the Catholic Church. And as a Catholic myself, I thought that was very peculiar because in the same sort of, in the same breath, in a way, he already also promised to really prosecute the case against people of faith who do not comport to essentially a secular liberal ideology, if for lack of a better term. So, for example, like the Little Sisters of the Poor, the Biden administration has promised to go, reopen that lawsuit and go after them. And again, the Little Sisters of the Poor case was when these Catholic nuns did not want to provide contraceptives to their employees, and all they do is they literally, Little Sisters of the Poor, they serve the poor. So the apparatus of the state went after Catholic nuns, trying to just do, works of corporal mercy. So again, we're in a peculiar place because the Biden administration, President Biden himself, you'll see a lot in the news, he's a devout Catholic, he's got his rosary beads, he really relies on his faith, it's the battle for the soul of the nation. But then in the same breath, he's comfortable going after people of faith who do not bend the knee towards sort of the new ideology.
So then do you think the goal here is not so much to rid us of religion altogether, but to more so redefine it and then kind of shape it into exactly what the left sees as.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And the left is smart because they're never going to get rid of religion.
Right.
So rather than get rid of religion, of course, again, if you want to go into sort of the intellectual heritage of the left, you think of Karl Marx, who said religion is the opiate of the masses. We need to get rid of religion. That didn't work out. And of course, because by human nature, we are religious animals.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are religious in sort of I'm Christian, I'm Buddhist, I'm Jewish, or I'm spiritual. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I believe in a higher power. It's kind of interesting because when you start polling Americans and asking them, what are your religious beliefs? Yes, there's an increase in sort of de-institutionalized religion.
Mm-hmm.
But if you also see what's going on with wokeism, woke ideology, it has all the trappings of a religion. That's a whole separate conversation, but it's just, it's interesting because, the Biden administration, they've even come out and said, well, we want to protect freedom of religion. And you kind of wonder, okay, what is freedom of religion in the eyes of the Biden administration? And it's like, well, freedom to worship, we're not gonna arrest you and pull you out of the walls of your church, at least not yet. But of course, that's sort of like, okay, you're allowed to believe what you believe, so long as it doesn't actually have any role to play in our political and civic life.
Right. So in talking about some of these examples, what are some of the trends that we've seen over time? You can even go a little further back if you want, just to kind of show how they've developed, of just attacks on religious liberty, either by the state or by kind of this anti-religious movement.
Yeah, I mean, again, of course, it's interesting because at the Supreme Court, there's been a lot of good recent victories for religious liberty, whether it's the Our Lady of Guadalupe, where the the ministerial exception was expanded, whether it was Fulton versus Philadelphia. Again, there's been good religious liberty precedents at the court to protect religious liberty, but that's why folks who are aggrieved by these developments are trying to find more creative ways to go after folks who refuse to compromise their beliefs in order to participate in the public square.
So I guess, so those are some really, what's going on right now then today? What are some of the attacks or the arguments that we're seeing of how religion is, or faith in general, are just playing too strong of roles in politics and in government, so they need to be completely excised in order to win their argument?
Again, this goes back to my earlier point. It's not so much getting rid of religion, it's do you have the right religion?
Okay.
And again, this actually goes back to, why, the proper understanding of religious liberty that our founders, established for us. And again, it's to basically decouple, the kind of, a national church and the state, right? And again, this comes from the kind of context of Europe and the religious wars. And there's this sort of misunderstanding now that, well, religious liberty, or I guess separation of church and state, means that religion must be completely expelled and hidden from any public life, right? Which is not the proper understanding of what it was. Right. But again, in terms of like how recent attacks have developed, activists on the other side are getting more creative about how, okay, so like if I can't force that guy to bake me the cake, there's got to be some other way I can compel him.
Right.
To affirm, I want to use the coercive power of government to compel a certain viewpoint from him. Mm-hmm. I don't care about his conscious rights. I care about what he should believe, and I'm going to make sure he does. So this is why actually the organization that I run exists, Napa Legal Institute, because we're looking at organizations, particularly religious nonprofits, and making sure that they have all the necessary protections in place to prevent themselves from being attacked by activists from like a compliance perspective, governance. So for example, what I mean by this is one of the recent Supreme Court cases, again, Our Lady of Guadalupe, it was, Catholic schools were basically being sued for having terminated someone, and they were saying, well, that person, one of the reasons why someone might get terminated from a Catholic school is because they're not living sort of the Catholic lifestyle that the school expects of them because of their religious beliefs. So when you get to that point, it's like, okay, well, you're discriminating against me, so I'm going to turn around and sue you. And the Catholic schools or any sort of religious institution will say, well, we're a religious institution. We have the right to hire and fire who we please based on our religious beliefs. So if that makes it to the court's going to look at that case and say, okay, the first thing we need to figure out is this school, is this institution authentically religious?
Right.
Now, what I mean by that is they don't say like, okay, the Supreme Court gets to decide if you're actually really Catholic. They look at your governing documents, they look at your sort of institutional documents, your marketing documents, and they see, are they actually conveying a religious message? Do they actually operate according to their self-professed religious beliefs? Because if that's so, then they are a genuine religious organization that deserves protections. So again, going back to Lady of Guadalupe, Justice Alito, when he was going through arguments, he actually went through their employee handbook line by line to see like if they actually have and affirm a Catholic identity, which they did, which helped them tremendously win that case. There's been other court cases in the past, we don't have to get into the details of them, but where an organization fired somebody, or a self-professed religious organization fired someone, and they said, well, we hire and fire according to our religious beliefs, and the court like, well, we looked at all your governing documents, there's nothing religious in them. So you're really religious in name only. So in a strange way, the way that the law has developed is compelling people of faith to really make sure that their institutions truly reflect their beliefs. There's like an authenticity to how you practice as a religious organization. So for example, like some of the things that we do at Napa Legal Institute, we've got sample bylaws in which we include religious liberty language, and then also so that you can actually avail yourselves of those existing protections that the court has established. So that if you are attacked, sued, like someone launches a compliance-focused attack against you, you can actually point to your governing document, you can point to your practice and say, no, we're an authentically religious organization and we have religious liberty, which has been, continues to be affirmed and outlined by the courts. So you can't persecute us.
So how does this work then with, if it's not like an affirmed religious institution or it's more of a company? So I'm like thinking of the private sector, with the Hobby Lobby case, Chick-fil-A stuff, where you have folks who are religious running the companies and who kind of believe these certain things, but then all of a sudden, the law kind of works against them because they obviously can't affirm that they're not a religious institution, right? So they're not just hiring Catholics or just hiring Christians.
Sure.
So it's just kind of, how does that all play out? Are there actual protections in place for folks in those positions?
So that's actually law that's continuing to develop, and there's going to be more from that in the near future, I suspect. But of course, like what we do know now is, at least from the kind of 501c3 religious nonprofit perspective, there are a lot of ways you can, protect yourself as an institution. So that's kind of where we're focused on now.
Gotcha.
But what we're doing is kind of serving as a model for, again, because I do get a lot of questions from like, say, there's a Christian businessman who wants to run his, large company in accordance with his beliefs, right? Like, Chick-fil-A, like, they have a right to stay closed on Sunday, right? Like, is that like, but what if like there's people that, well, the board wants to compel the chairman to open on Sundays because we'll make more money, and the chairman's like, well, no, this is a reflection of my belief in the Sabbath and all this stuff, so we're going to stay closed. So again, that gets to more individuals rather than institutions, and right now we're kind of focused on institutions.
Gotcha. I want to go back to the initial question, because you said let's properly define what religion is.
Right.
But I also want to properly define what the state is. So if religion, as we know it, which is practicing of Judeo-Christian faiths rather than the progressive left's woke ideological faith, is that. But then the state is essentially who's the ruler, like who's the traditional, like who's the enemy of the traditional ruler versus like we've got the state itself and the government, right? But what about big tech oligarchs? What about like who's ruling the information flow, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's funny because that is the political question, sovereignty. Where does sovereignty lie? Does it lie in the consent of the governed? Does it lie in, a king, a monarch? Again, this is a fundamental question. But in terms of how the founders viewed religious liberty and religion, it's actually it's quite interesting. We focus a lot, again, on the First Amendment, and sort of actually one of my personal pet peeves about folks who talk about the First Amendment, who are friendly to the First Amendment, they always say, well, you're violating my First Amendment rights. There's no such thing as First Amendment rights. There are rights protected under the First Amendment.
Right.
Because once you say First Amendment rights, what you're implying is that those rights were given to you by an amendment in the Constitution.
That's a good point.
And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of natural rights. I mean, there's a reason why in the Declaration of Independence, it's unalienable rights that cannot be separated from you as a person because they're owed to you by nature. So they don't come from government. Government exists to protect those rights. That's why men institute governments among themselves. So again, this is sort of a fundamental understanding of the founders, like why.
Or just the Constitution.
Yeah.
Which would be great if we could teach civics.
Well, yeah, exactly. And if you look at documents from the founding era, I mean, one of the most important documents that is not read enough anymore in high schools across the country is George Washington's farewell address.
Yeah.
In that address, he says, in order to achieve, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but in order to achieve political prosperity, we need the indispensable pillars of religion and morality. And let us disabuse ourselves of the idea that you can have morality without religion. This is also why John Adams said that the Constitution, our form of government, is wholly created for a religious people.
Yeah.
A moral people. Because again, if you get to the idea of self-government, what does self-government mean? Well, first you're governing yourself as a person, but then you're also entering into a form of government in which you rule and consent to being ruled in turn. Right. So again, you can't have self-government in a society of moral reprobates.
Right.
It's that simple. Because then you have just pure licentiousness, viciousness. I mean, there's a reason why when
it'd be anarchy.
Yeah, it'd be essentially anarchy. Yeah. And so again, Washington recognized that, Adams recognized that, even Jefferson recognized that. That was not up for debate. Like, religious liberty is incredibly important because, again, that the liberty to practice your religion, obviously affords you the ability to also have the right to practice, express your conscience, which is why speech, right? Like, again, man is a rational animal. We're the only ones that can communicate through speech, which is why free speech is so important.
Right.
And so it's not a mistake that the First Amendment includes both free speech and free religion.
Right.
You can't have one without the other, in my opinion. They're integrated with one another.
Absolutely. So with the tactics that we're seeing now, so the reason I brought up big tech oligarchs earlier is because this is a newer thing that we're starting to see. And I know you've done a little bit of work on this. So yes, they may not be our government, but they certainly do control flow of information, which is a significant power to wield in this country, especially when everything that we hear and see and read essentially is filtered through Google, Apple, I guess Amazon too, like all these various large companies. So what are the reasons they would be interested, first of all, in tamping down and censoring faith or religion? And then how are they going about it?
Sure. Well, again, the big tech issue is extremely concerning and alarming because never has there existed private institutions of such size and also with such power. And what I mean by that is, we think about like trust busting in the Gilded Age and the railroads and the oilmen, but the railroad tycoons and the oilmen, they didn't have all our data. They didn't know everything that Facebook, Google, Amazon knows about us.
Right.
Nor could they really destroy you, and basically unperson you, right? So big tech, I mean, it's, the reason why this debate is so contentious is because this is really a novel problem. I mean, sure, there's precedents, right? Like, do we declare big tech companies, common carriers and things like that, and try to get into those debates? But I mean, we're really just struggling with something in that, a handful of folks in Silicon Valley control a disproportionate amount of information, and we live in the information age. Yeah. Which is why everything that's happened, since the last election to now, with deplatforming, censoring, these tycoons, if you want to call them that, tech tycoons in Silicon Valley, they really do, view themselves as like, well, I'm doing something noble because I'm trying to control the discourse and make sure no one's discriminating against somebody else. And And of course, the irony too, of course, is like folks like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, they thought, well, my platform is going to change the world because people from across the world are going to be able to talk to each other and share ideas, and we get to basically kind of a global community. But the irony, of course, is what's happened instead is everyone has used the internet and has used platforms to kind of huddle in their own echo chambers and only talk to themselves, and it's actually destroyed free discourse in its sort of ironic way. But again, getting back to the idea of big tech and censorship, again, I was observing this with great concern, especially as tech companies were deplatforming and silencing people with political opinions with which they didn't agree with. I mean, again, it's so funny. Even just recently, the Hunter Biden laptop story that was published by the New York Post. New York Post got their account shut down. And of course, this is like one of the oldest papers in the United States, founded by Alexander Hamilton, reputable reporting. And during the election, when the story came out about Hunter Biden's laptop, they got totally, censored across all social media platforms. They were, the other side was saying, well, this is Russian disinformation. And just recently, we're finding out now that, oh, actually, it was true.
It was all true.
It was all true. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, who gets to decide?
And they still haven't reposted the articles that they took down.
Right, exactly. So, again, we worry as Americans, like, well, we no longer are trusting our institutions, and this is bad. Well, they keep doing this kind of stuff, right? So, like, it's hard to trust these big tech oligarchs, these big tech institutions with the power of censoring speech when they keep messing up, And
is it a recognized thing though that they're messing up? Is this a well-known fact amongst the population?
I think I think average Americans are starting to recognize this and wake up to it, because that's not the only story in which got censored and then we find out later that it's true. And of course, you're suddenly at the mercy of someone across through a screen that you don't see or don't know that decides, oh, you know what, I don't like that story, or I think it's discriminatory or harmful. And you kind of like, well, what's your point of reference?
Right.
Like who gets to decide? Who rules, right? So, and again, I definitely respect, my libertarian friends who kind of get to the point, well, this is, big tech companies, they can't put you in jail, build your, just start your own platforms, and, we don't want to bully private institutions, private companies, in the same way that we don't want the government to bully, say, Jack the Cake Baker. But Jack the Cake Baker is not Jack Dorsey, the Twitter CEO. Those are two totally different things. It's not an apples to apples situation. And I just don't understand why, our libertarian friends won't engage on that point.
Yeah, I mean, these big tech companies, they can't punish you for not using their platforms or for posting something they don't like, but they certainly can destroy your life or allow others to destroy your life
or
using
career,
their platform or your career.
Yeah. I mean, just for example, Monopoly. I sometimes get Monopoly and Amazon mixed up in my head. Amazon,
a Freudian slip.
Yeah, a Freudian slip. Amazon holds almost a complete market control over book sales. I forget what the percentage is, but it's overwhelming. So, for example, Ryan Anderson wrote a book, When Harry Became Sally, a critique of sort of the transgender movement and, sort of the kind of ideological underpinnings of it. That book was published, like 3 or so years ago. It was on Amazon's platform, no problem. This was during the Trump administration when he published the book. And then, the Biden administration comes in, and then all of a sudden Amazon feels like they have the, like, oh, well, we have the moral authority now that we can just kind of disappear that book. And so what happens if your book gets disappeared from Amazon, it's essentially completely disappeared from the market.
Right.
So then you're saying, so how does a private company control all of the sort of book sales and discourse? Like, that seems concerning to me. Yep. Right? If again, like, the public square, and when you say public square, it's like anyone can enter into the square and share their beliefs. When the public square becomes increasingly digital, and the people who control the digital public square are all private individuals with certain ideological commitments, that should be a concern to everybody.
Yeah, that's really
So
good.
again, I'm not suggesting at this time, like, here's the exact policy thing that we need to do to solve the problem. What my organization is doing instead is spotlighting the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And we're spotlighting it from the perspective of faith. So for example, like, again, going back to what happened, following the election, there's this big purge on social media, right? And of course, the irony too was like and then Parler, everyone tried to jump over to Parler, and then all of a sudden Parler mysteriously disappeared. And you start to think like, wait, I thought you said build your own Google, It's like,
yep, exactly.
we tried to do that, So anyway, so because people were nervous about the Twitter crackdown on their free speech, So, of course, a lot of kind of political conservatives were getting censored or their accounts suspended. But we also started to notice a trend over time that wasn't just political conservatives, it was also people of religious faith that were getting deplatformed for, saying, wrong think, if you want to call it that. So like, for example, Focus on the Family, which is a Christian organization, they have a news site called Daily Citizen. And I think the Daily Citizen put out a tweet that said something like, announcing how the Biden administration has appointed, I forget her first name, but Mrs. Levine, a transgender woman, to as a, at HHS, a man who believes he is a woman. That tweet, was flagged as harmful and offensive. And it's like, well, isn't that what is that trans is? So wait, like, we're trying to wrap our head around certain terms, right? So, a man who believes he is a woman, isn't that what that is? Or is that not? So again, we don't know who's making these decisions about our discourse, but we do know that, say, and again, it wasn't like inflammatory. It wasn't an inflammatory tweet. It was just like, this is who this person is.
Right.
And this continues to happen apace. And it's not just, the transgender issue. There's also other folks getting deplatformed and censored for other reasons that, that come from sort of the faith perspective.
Right.
So we started tracking this, and we actually published a report in which we found that this was happening at least once a week.
Wow.
So then I wrote an op-ed about it that got some attention. It was in the Wall Street Journal. Because it's like, well, this is a problem because it's not just, big tech.
Once a week.
Yeah.
Wow.
Big tech censors religion too, right? So again, we were just spotlighting the issue. We're saying, look, this is happening. We should be aware of it. And again, it's interesting because one of the points we raised is, well, it's funny because a lot of these big tech companies have in their non-discrimination policies, like, we will not permit discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, kind of like that boilerplate, civil rights era language. And so we're kind of like, well, they're saying that in their terms and conditions, but then they turn around and they deplatform somebody because they share a particular religious opinion that is offensive.
And once a week, it was specifically not only for religious organizations, but it was based on it was their posts that they were essentially censoring and taking down. And okay, interesting. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so then the transgender issue, I mean, heck, that's with Ryan Anderson's book. That's like a digital book burning. I mean, that's.
Well, and the amazing thing about Ryan's book is it is just like it's not, an inflammatory book. It's, it's got a catchy title, but then it's just full of, carefully researched facts, examples, looking at the medical community, kind of how they've kind of transitioned ideologically. But you would think he wrote some crazy Mein Kampf script.
Right. Which Mein Kampf, by the way, is still available on Amazon.
Right. So it's like, why, why are we deciding that Mein Kampf is okay, but when Harry became Sally is not?
Yeah. Or that Clarence Thomas's documentary is not okay during Black History Month. Right?
Exactly.
Take that off? Yeah.
Right. And so this gets back to the idea of, if you want to know who rules, you figure out what speech and what ideas are permitted in society, right? Again, I've also heard this before from like the comedian's perspective. In a free society, if you really want to know who's in charge, figure out who you're allowed to make fun of.
That's a good point.
Who are you allowed to make fun of? You're sure allowed to make fun of MAGA, conservatives and those
Christians,
backwards Christians.
Yeah.
You can do that all day and you'll get a Netflix special.
Yeah.
If you start making fun of the other side, you're a bigot.
Yeah.
And you need to be depersoned.
Yeah, on the abortion issue, I remember, I forget what her name is. She's this comedian. She has a show now, I think, on HBO. But she would joke about abortion as if, but it wasn't that she was joking. She was just saying it in a joking manner, but she was being 100% honest. It wasn't really a joke. She was basically just saying we should be able to go through drive-thrus and get abortions whenever we want. Sure. And it should just be as easy as ordering a sandwich off of a McDonald's menu. So, and that's, to me, I'm like, the fact that someone could actually stand up there, say that, and actually get laughs from the audience, and that's an acceptable joke, right? That is a hit directly on anyone who's like of a Christian religion or faith or Judeo-Christian.
Yeah, and this is and again, this is the challenge of a free society. Again, I have a lot of libertarian friends, and we have a lot of these conversations often. We don't live in sort of a libertarian utopia where all opinions can be permitted, any choice you make is fine so long as it's an acknowledgement of your individual autonomy. Libertarianism is a market theory, not a political theory. And we'll
tell them that.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, I know so conservatism is a political theory.
Right.
Liberalism is a political theory.
Yes.
Progressivism is progressivism is a political theory.
Yeah.
But again, what I mean by that is every society in all of human history has standards. We all live by a particular set of standards. This is the nature of the law, right? And of course, in a free society, this again gets back to the founder's point. You can't have a free society amongst just moral reprobates. You have to have some sort of transcendent order that compels people to treat each other correctly and respect each other and worship with one another, which is why again, this gets back to why freedom of religion is important. But again, what I mean by this is, like, even though we seem to live in a time where all standards are being thrown out the window, you still live in a society where you are not allowed to make fun of certain people. You're not allowed to laugh at certain things. This gets into our PC culture.
Yeah.
And of course, this is actually where I appreciate my libertarian friends, because they recognize that, hey, I have the right to say and do what I please in that respect. Right. But again, I think that says, and this gets back to the big tech issue, that you've got mega private corporations policing how people think and interact with one another. I think that just says that says something larger about this sort of rot in our civil society.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the big tech question is definitely, it's one that that conservatives are having a tough time grappling with, specifically because of their libertarian tendencies with the free market and not wanting to control the private sector with the government. And so this is always, I think, you haven't seen a real consensus come out from the conservative movement or with the libertarians on like what to do about big tech. And in the meantime, while we're all debating it, they're thriving and growing, and they're brainwashing people at this point. It's like I think it was an article just the other day that I saw. I think it was Blake Masters who's running for office down in Arizona. That's not an endorsement, I'm just saying. But he basically wrote an article about how the way that social media and television, the way that the ads are, it's all designed to make you not be able to look away. It's all designed to draw you in and to keep you there for as long as possible, so they can collect as much information on you as possible, and therefore so they can turn that into revenue, right? So there's definitely a goal there, and it's just we're not really seeing it. Or even for those who are, it's still almost impossible. We live in a society where how do you pull away? This podcast right now is going to be on Anchor, it's going to be on Apple. This is going to be on YouTube. How do you pull away from all of that when the entire society that we operate in is completely intertwined? Yeah,
again, this gets back to when we were doing our research on big tech censorship of religion. One of the things I suggest and advise folks, and unofficially, is like, don't self-censor yourself. Instead prepare for getting deplatformed and know that there's certain opinions. If you share them, you have every right to share them. But if you share them, just be prepared and know that you will get censored, and be prepared. Like if you're running an organization and all your videos are uploaded on YouTube, and you try to do a YouTube video on a particular issue that is out of line with sort of the prevailing ideology in Silicon Valley, I hope you have all your YouTube videos backed up. Because there's been stories where there's been people because like churches, people of faith, they have YouTube videos, and then they get shut out of their accounts, and then they can't access like hundreds of, maybe even sometimes thousands of hours of content for indefinitely, because there's not really hardly a clear appeals process in any of these big tech companies. And they didn't, it's like, well, you should have, now that we know that there's a pattern of censorship, you need to kind of be prudent,
right,
and think of ways to protect yourself, like anticipate, because you may not know the day nor the hour that you get censored.
Right.
Make sure you're backing up your content, make sure that you have relationships in the media so that you can get your word out and say, hey, I got deplatformed, I got censored. Because again, the Ryan Anderson example is great because, he has a platform.
Mm-hmm.
So, he got a lot of media attention when his book basically got, digitally burned. The small, mom and pop, Christian bookstore who has a YouTube account or whatever, or a Twitter account or an account with Amazon, they don't have that kind of platform. So they have to take extra, cautionary steps to make sure that, if they're selling content that is out of line with secular progressivism, that content is protected on another platform.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you said to make sure we shouldn't self-censor, right? And that's kind of the biggest thing I always talk about with free speech, because they do want to compel you to believe and kind of follow in with a certain ideology and a way of speaking about things. But it's been more interesting is when you said, like, when you're creating videos, when you're writing your books, when you're writing articles, don't censor it knowing that it's going to be censored. Don't write it as if you're because this is exactly what happened in the USSR, in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, of course.
And so, because it's so funny that we can't even see it, that we're actually censoring ourselves just in the way that many of the authors, the dissenting authors in the Soviet Union at the time, would write their books, and they would write them in such a way that they were already kind of pre-censored. So the idea kind of slipped in there, but up to dissent from the Soviet Union, but it was not blatantly said because they knew in writing it that it'd eventually be censored anyways. They'd probably get arrested and disappear.
Yeah, and I think what we're facing now is, some folks have used the term like soft totalitarianism, right? Totalitarianism means a government that controls every aspect of your life. That's different from an authoritarian government.
Right.
An authoritarian government, will permit whatever happens in civil society so long as you don't step out of line, and you can kind of believe what you want so long as you don't control or you don't challenge the whoever the strong man is, the state. But a totalitarian government is invested in every aspect of your life, civil society. That's why they want to get rid of religion, because religion. A totalitarian regime recognizes religion as a challenge to its authority, right? How can you owe allegiance to something other than the state?
And this is why in the Soviet Union they were an atheist regime.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a totalitarian regime.
Right.
Versus say, one of the sort of strong men in South America. Those are authoritarian regimes. They're not good.
Right. They're still very corrupt.
Yeah, they're corrupt and they're bad, but they're not. But being an authoritarian regime is much different from a totalitarian regime. Now, a soft totalitarianism, that would imply that it's not the secret police are not knocking on your door and dragging you out of the middle of the night in the United States of America. It's not happening. But what's instead happening is we're going to use market power and we're going to exclude people from participating in society who don't affirm what we want them to affirm in terms of ideologically. So of course, what I mean by that is, say all of a sudden, you get canceled by your bank. Whether it's like Fidelity, or some of these other major financial institutions that are going woke. The reason why that's a big concern is because what they're going to do is kind of defund you, unperson you, to essentially do everything up to the point of killing you, right? Because it's like, if you can't have a bank, you can't get hired, you can't. So again, it's sort of a tyranny of exclusion.
Yeah.
Soft totalitarianism, that's another word for it. But that's kind of what concerns me the most, is that, as the left continues to control and capture all the institutions, institutions are how we live as people. Because institutions are simply a collection of people coming together for a shared purpose. Yuval Levin makes this point in his book, A Time to Build. Institutions are what support society, civil society. But if all the institutions are captured, who do we, human beings are political animals. We can't get together and try and do something together. So again, it's concerning because, it's like, well, build your own Google, build your own this, build your own that. Might as well just tell us to build our own country.
Right. Well, yeah, and not to mention, no, that's a really good point. Because Google, first of all, not only to mention how these companies are essentially monopolies, and we've kind of let them get to that point. Someone was mentioning the other day that when students are in like the big tech, Silicon Valley, when that's their goals to create these like different computer programs and stuff, their goal today isn't to just build something new and innovative. It's actually what success looks like to them is to create something so awesome that Mark Zuckerberg buys it from them. But so that shouldn't be the goal, right? But that is. They don't want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, right? This is, I think, the same article that I mentioned earlier by Masters. But I just thought that was kind of a really interesting thing because that does show that with all that's going on with this takeover institutions, with this soft totalitarianism, we are adapting to accept it. The society is starting like it is. And if you look at, when we look at Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, and we look at communist China right now, when we look at these countries and how they've developed in the way that they did before they got to the really bad part that we talk about all the time in history classes, this, even though they didn't have the technology we have available today, this is kind of how it seeps in. It seeps in really slowly, not like quick, not quickly, but just kind of enough to give you a taste of it and not jump away. Just like kind of like a frog in boiling water, obviously.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And so it is disconcerting, like you said, to see them take over these institutions, but then it's even worse that we're seeing people not even notice it or attempt to do anything about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'm not going to make any sort of predictions, but I do anticipate it's going to get worse before it gets better because the only time that, to really politically galvanize people, you have to start affecting their normal lives. Normal Americans who don't think about this like you and I every day do, who are just, they want to have a job, live in a home, send their kids to school. But it's interesting, Americans are starting to politically wake up to what's going on. I think COVID has accelerated this, right? So for example, this all of the noise right now over critical race theory, you think critical race theory was this brand new thing that happened because of wokeness, and it's wokeness created CRT. It's actually the other way around. CRT created wokeness, and CRT was incubated and created in the academy in the 70s and the 80s, and and that's where these bad ideas start. And then they get put into the bloodstream because all of our elites graduate from universities, and then they hold these sort of ideological beliefs, and then they populate our institutions, and then institutions go after regular Americans. So anyway, it's interesting with the COVID stuff. All of a sudden kids were forced to do Zoom class, virtual class. So parents suddenly got an insight into the classroom that they didn't get before. And, they'd be looking over their kids' shoulders and they're like, wait, what? You're telling my child that he's inherently racist and that he should hate himself, whatever, so it's like, so all of a sudden parents started, showing up at school board meetings and, making a noise about what's going on and like why this is a poisonous ideology and why we can't have a community in which everyone hates each other for grievances from the past. So anyway, that's an example of how you finally kind of shift the overtone window, because once you kind of nudge, normal Americans in a direction they don't want to go, when they can actually tangibly feel it and see it, that's when they act politically. Because again, most Americans aren't activists, right? But they become activists when their normal lives are infringed.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and it will be something to continue to look out for, like what we've seen in the school districts. But the one thing I think is even more interesting is, so in the past where you had these kind of activities, so I guess I'm going to bring up the fact that we have such a dopamine effect where our brains are drenched with satisfaction and complacency all the time because of the internet, social media, and television, these streaming services. So we have constant 24-hour, 7-day-a-week access to something to distract ourselves from what's going on in society.
Yeah.
In the past, we've had things that existed like that, like radio shows, sports, games.
Bread and circuses.
Yeah, bread and circuses, or gladiator shows, but those
Yeah.
were all restricted and limited by time windows, right? Like you could
Sure.
only access them at certain times of the day or every
Right.
week. Now that we have this 24-hour, news cycle, 24-hour, like you can go on the internet anytime, any place, and access a distraction.
Yeah.
What is this how long is it gonna take for us to be affected in our normal lives if we can constantly be distracted?
Well, I love what my friends at Claremont say about this. The joke is that, live in the pod, eat the bugs, watch the porn. Like that's,
Right.
just create a society of dependent, immoral, selfish people. Again, this is why virtue is so important. This is something from the founders. You can't have Republican self-government without virtue, and virtue is inculcated through religious belief. That was the formulation, because that was sort of the founders bringing together, Athens and Jerusalem, but then also their own sort of English common law tradition and heritage, and then that's what created the American founding. But yeah, we live in a completely distracted age, and it's a signal and it's a warning of ongoing decadence and decline. Right. Because we're seeing this in our regime with with CRT, like if we can't have and we can't meet sort of the geopolitical challenges of our time, if we have a society of citizens who hate their own country and they hate their fellow citizens, and all they want to do is watch Netflix and eat takeout. Like that, we might as well just hand the keys over to China now, right? Like, that's exactly what's going on.
Right.
But again, that's why we need to continue to look for great statesmen and stateswomen who will move the country in the right direction and galvanize people to care about those timeless ideas. Those aren't old ideas; they're timeless ideas.
Right. Exactly. No, that is a really great note actually to end on.
Yeah.
So Josh, thank you so much for joining our episode of Well Said. Well Said is a bi-weekly YouTube show / podcast. We're on Anchor. Feel free to share us on any of the podcast platforms. Give us a 5-star rating if you like what you heard. And I look forward to our next one. But thank you, Josh. That was well said.
Thank you, Cherise.